So last December, APRA issued the final version of their Strengthening Superannuation Member Outcomes. It's a package which they consulted on previously. It contains a paper which addresses the issues raised in consultation, but then also outlines the changes which APRA is making to the Risk Management Prudential Standard. It issues a new Prudential Standard, the Strategic Planning and Member Outcomes Prudential Standard, and they also provide two Prudential Practice Guides. So these are more detailed documents which provide a description of how APRA would expect superannuation trustee to adhere to the obligations which the changed Risk Management Standard and the new Member Outcome Standard are placing on. So the overarching purpose of the package is to promote sound management of superannuation funds. So APRA have been quite lucid in their description of some opportunities for improvement which they have seen in their reviews which they conduct across the industry. In doing that, they did identify areas which they did feel that some superannuation trustees may have been failing in achieving member outcomes consistent with what the members would expect and what regulators expect of trustees. So there are four key components to the package at the highest level. There's a requirement around the need to set strategic objectives. There's also a requirement on superannuation trustees to put together a business plan which implements those strategic objectives. There are some new obligations around how expenditure needs to be managed, in particular looking at significant or extraordinary expenditure. And finally, there's a new requirement which is being imposed on all superannuation trustees as part of their strategic planning processes to complete an outcomes assessment. So this outcomes assessment is a new concept, but it introduces an obligation to trace through from their strategic objectives all the way through to different cohorts or segments of members, objectives which are appropriate for those members and align with the overarching objectives of the fund. The new Prudential Standard and changes to the Risk Management Prudential Standard commence on the 1st of January 2020. So APRA likes to take a principles-based approach with their prudential standards, which generally gives some flexibility to trustees to apply these requirements in a way which is appropriate for the nature of their fund or their business and the size and scale of their operation. Having said that, APRA have been quite specific in defining what they mean by strategic objectives. They have been quite open-handed in suggesting that these won't necessarily be called strategic objectives by the fund. They may be called values, vision or something similar. However, they have been quite clear in saying that they do expect strategic objectives to be specific and measurable, so they can't be too fluid and difficult to define. They need to align to the outcomes which are being sought for their members. They also need to have consideration of the trustees' risk appetite. So what we're seeing is the existing strategic planning risk, which was required to be included as a material risk under the risk management framework, being moved out of the risk framework into a standalone standard. Having said that, it still remains important that in setting strategic objectives that the trustee gives consideration to the risk appetite statement which the board signs off on each year. Further to that, trustees are required to give consideration to their obligations and the duties that they owe to members, both in general law and under the SIS Act. So the Prudential Standard is specific in making reference to requirements to have a risk management strategy, to have an income management strategy, to have a reserves management strategy and an investment management strategy. So the SIS Act does impose these duties on trustees to have specific strategies in areas of particular concern for the regulator. So in coming to strategic objectives, trustees are expected to consider their duties owed to members, both specific in the SIS Act, in addition to their general law duties which they owe. The final piece of guidance which APRA provides around setting strategic objectives is to ensure that consideration is given to the sole purpose test. So again, another SIS Act requirement which sees superannuation trustees being required to manage the fund for the sole purpose of the retirement income needs of their members. It's an interesting term, sole purpose. If we do look at the guidance which has been provided by APRA around this, we do know that it's not necessarily a sole purpose test. It's a dominant purpose test which is applied to this, and we'd expect that superannuation trustee would align a dominant purpose act to their process of setting strategic objectives also. So I'd foresee that the strategic objectives are going to fall within a few broad categories. I can certainly see that most, if not all, superannuation trustees will be having some objectives around the efficiency of the fund in ensuring that money which is spent is done so in a productive and an effective manner. We're also likely to see strategic objectives focused on growth. So that will often take the form of maximising the investment returns, the net investment returns to members, which then contributes to ensuring that they've got either an adequate or comfortable retirement, to use some of the common indexes which are relied on. We're also likely to see most superannuation trustees setting some strategic objectives around stability and risk management. So in balancing the efficiency and growth objectives, it's also going to be important that the volatility which can be experienced in pursuing those objectives is managed in a way appropriate for the members' expectations. That's very closely aligned to ensuring that you have sustainability in the business operations of that superannuation fund and the trustee. And finally, I think we're going to see some funds having strategic objectives around ensuring that members have the flexibility to arrange their affairs in a way which is consistent with their personal needs. So we do see that superannuation funds do offer varying degrees of flexibility in the control members have over various aspects of their interest in the fund. So we'll see strategic objectives focused on allowing members to have an appropriate level of flexibility in aligning their arrangements to their personal circumstances. So APRA is expecting that superannuation trustees go through an annual process of putting a business plan together, which is something which most superannuation funds would be familiar with and already complete as part of their usual business activities. However, there are some details which APRA has prescribed as being the minimum requirements around your business plan. And the first one is the requirement to include financial projections over the next 3-year period. In doing so, it's likely that trustees are going to make some assumptions to come to those projections. APRA has a requirement that trustees define what those assumptions are and how those assumptions interact with the risk appetite which the trustees defined in their risk appetite statement. Finally, and I think this is probably the most important aspect of any business plan, APRA has identified as another minimum requirement that key performance indicators need to be set. If business initiatives are going to be undertaken, it's critical that a trustee is able to set some metrics which are measurable and then monitor performance towards those metrics to ensure that the investments which are being made in those initiatives are achieving the goals which they were initially set out to achieve. The guidance is quite specific in identifying two key areas of expenditure which warrant a certain kind of consideration. So APRA has earmarked significant expenditure and extraordinary expenditure as being kinds of expenses which warrant a heightened degree of prudence and care when the decisions are being made around those. The first question which jumps to mind around a concept of significant expenditure is how much. Probably unsurprisingly, APRA hasn't prescribed a certain amount. They've taken a principles-based approach to defining significant expenditure as being something which will differ between superannuation funds. They do, however, provide some clear guidance in defining any material business activities which are outsourced as being something which would certainly qualify as significant expenditure. In a superannuation context, it's quite common for a trustee to outsource some key business functions, primarily your custodial services, investment management, your insurance, and finally your administration. So these key business areas will certainly fall within the scope of significant expenditure. In addition to that, we would expect that there will be other expenses such as the use of professional services or the investment in technologies which trustees use to service their members. These may also constitute significant expenditure, warranting the extra scrutiny which APRA expects. Extraordinary, again, I guess it has its plain English meaning, and APRA provides such guidance. Extraordinary expenditure is anything which wasn't planned for or was unforeseen. It probably goes without saying that it is a prudent thing to do, to go through a thorough process to ensure that that expenditure aligns with a strategic objective which has been defined by the fund and can be traced through to that throughout that process of engaging in the initiative. So there's a theme throughout the member outcomes package around traceability from your strategic objectives through to your activities, through to your expenditure, and then monitoring performance on that. And expenditure is one example of that. Like the business planning process, the requirements on making a decision on expenditure have a couple of prescribed requirements. One of those important ones is the setting of metrics as to how the effectiveness of that expenditure is managed, but then also setting some triggers, so points at which if the metrics aren't suggesting the objectives are being satisfied, that intervention from the trustee board is required. So we're fortunate in that APRA have put together a standalone prudential practice guide on the outcomes assessment. So APRA have been quite detailed in the guidance that they've provided. They've done so because the concept is new and it's an activity which superannuation trustees won't have undertaken in the past in most cases. So the guidance is quite specific in outlining what's expected. So funds will all typically have a cycle through which they go through their strategic and business planning. We're less than 12 months out from the new requirements coming into effect. So we're likely to see within the next 12-month period all superannuation funds having at least one iteration of their strategic and business planning cycle prior to the new Prudential Standard commencing. So there is an opportunity for all superannuation funds to start to integrate some of the requirements under the Prudential Standard within their next round of strategic business planning. The transition can certainly be made easier if a trustee does make an attempt to incorporate as many of the requirements as possible, as soon as possible. Like any change which is implemented within an organisation, there are often teething issues and aspects which don't run as smoothly as may have been hoped for. So the sooner that superannuation trustees can start to integrate some of the principles defined in the standard within their processes, the better prepared they're going to be once they come into effect on the 1st of January next year. There's an awful lot going on, and it's coming from a number of different fronts. I guess the most obvious question around the member outcomes package refers back to the bill which was introduced into Parliament in 2017. So the bill has not passed Parliament given the number of sitting days until the Parliament is going to be busy with budgetary business. It's unlikely that we'll see much progress on the member outcomes bill, which is currently in Parliament. So this bill is intended to be complementary to the package which APRA has released. However, it's different in that it's specific to MySuper products. The bill grants APRA certain powers to compel trustees of MySuper products to undertake certain actions, and even has powers to force some trustees, if they're not achieving member outcomes over a sustained period, into consolidation and mergers with other funds. So the bill in Parliament is complementary to the package which has been released. APRA have flagged that, given there's some uncertainty in Parliament, if it were to pass and be amended in the process, APRA has indicated that they'll be flexible with the prudential standard and guidance to adjust that as need may be if there's a change with the bill before Parliament. It's probably worth also just being clear that the changes which APRA has implemented in December, these don't rely on that bill passing Parliament. So the APRA has the power to issue prudential standards, and these will come into effect next 1st of January, irrespective of what happens with the bill in Parliament.